This is you. You're sitting in the back seat of an armored SUV, doing 75 miles an hour on Mexico City's Periferico at 2 in the morning. Outside, the city sleeps with that false tranquility that big cities have when they turn off the lights. Inside, you're checking your phone with one hand and holding a cup of coffee that went cold half an hour ago with the other, still gripping it like letting go would be admitting you're exhausted. You've gone 72 hours without sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch. Your body knows it even if your mind refuses to acknowledge it. 2 escorts ride up front in silence, 2 more in a second unit trailing you by about 60 feet. The radio crackles every so often with codes you no longer need to decode, because after this many years in the business, the numbers and call signs live tattooed somewhere in the part of your brain that never fully rests. Your phone vibrates. It's a number you don't have saved but recognize immediately. You let it ring 3 times before answering, because in this line of work, that 3-second pause before picking up has saved you more than once from saying something you shouldn't. You answer. The voice on the other end is calm. Too calm for the hour and for what it's telling you. It informs you there's movement in a neighborhood on the east side of the city. Armed individuals, at least 12 of them, coordinated, carrying information that nobody outside your own structure should have. The word leak never gets said out loud, but it floats through the cab of the SUV like cigarette smoke in a sealed room. You hang up. You tell the driver to change the route. And as the SUV takes a different exit and the lights of the Periferico fall away behind you, your mind travels on its own back to the beginning. Back to the place where all of this started. Back to the kid you were before you became the man who now changes routes at 2 in the morning because someone somewhere decided you're a problem that needs to be handled. You were born in Mexico City into a family with nothing extraordinary about it, which in this country means it had everything necessary to survive and very little to get ahead. Your dad was an accountant at a distribution company in the Doctores neighborhood. A meticulous man, the kind who checks every number twice before signing off on it, who came home with his briefcase under his arm and his tie loosened exactly 2 centimeters, not one more. Your mom taught math at a public middle school in Tepito, which required a kind of courage you can't learn from any book. Every day she stood in front of 40 teenagers who came from broken homes, from rough streets, from realities that no curriculum accounts for. And she explained equations with the conviction of someone who genuinely believes that knowledge is the only key that opens doors money can't buy. You had an older brother, Carlos, who was studying engineering at the Poli on a scholarship he'd earned through sheer hard work, and a younger sister, Monica, who was 8 years old and collected animal stickers with the seriousness of a scientific researcher. It was a lower middle-class family that paid its rent on time, that ate together on Sundays over red rice and chicken and green salsa, and that lived with the quiet steadiness of people who know they don't have extra but don't lack what's essential. You were 17, and you already knew what you wanted to be. Not because anyone had told you, but because you'd seen enough of your city to understand that there was an enormous gap between the world as it should be and the world as it was, and that someone had to live inside that gap to keep the two halves from splitting apart entirely. You wanted to be a cop, not the kind that show up in the news for the wrong reasons, not the kind that look the other way when money changes hands. You wanted to be one of the other ones, the ones who exist in smaller numbers but do exist, the ones who come home with clean hands even if they come home late and worn out. Your dad looked at you when you told him with that expression fathers get when a son chooses a path they respect but that frightens them. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he put his hand on your shoulder and told you that if that's what you wanted, then do it all the way, that nothing is worth going into halfway. Your mom prayed that night. You knew because you heard her in a low voice from the hallway. On the first day they lined you up in a courtyard, under a July sun falling straight down like a punishment, and the instructor told the 43 cadets standing in front of him that half of them wouldn't finish the year. Not because they were incapable, but because this job filters for the ones willing to pay the price nobody explains in the recruitment announcement. The price isn't the physical training, brutal as that is. The price is learning to live with a permanent tension that sets up somewhere between your shoulder blades and never fully disappears. You learn to sleep with one ear open. You learn that trust is a scarce resource managed with the same discipline as ammunition. Your best friend at the academy was named Ernesto Villanueva, originally from Monterrey, son of a doctor and a nurse, with that combination of northern Mexican seriousness and dry sense of humor that made his company simultaneously reassuring and unpredictable. Ernesto was 2 inches taller than you, ran 3 minutes faster on the 5-kilometer course, and had the strange ability to fall asleep on any surface in under 2 minutes. He said that was his superpower, and that someday it would save his life. He was wrong about the second part. The first years in active service were exactly what you expected and completely different from what you imagined. You expected the hard work, the long shifts, the bureaucracy that slows down what should flow freely. What you didn't expect was the human dimension of every case. Every file was a family. Every arrest was a story that had started long before you showed up in it. Every victim was someone who that morning had eaten breakfast without knowing it was their last quiet breakfast. That weight accumulates in ways nobody prepares you to carry. You moved up at a pace that made some people uncomfortable and made very few people proud, not because you were smarter than everyone else, but because you had an ability to connect information that others treated as separate compartments. You saw patterns where others saw coincidences. You asked questions nobody had thought to ask because they assumed the answer was obvious. Your director at that time, General Armando Perez Lira, a 60-year-old man with a gray mustache and the straight back of someone who wore a uniform for 4 decades, called you into his office on a Tuesday afternoon and told you something you've spent years trying to figure out was a compliment or a warning. He told you, the best ones in this business are the ones the system can't bend, and that makes them valuable and dangerous at the same time. He didn't explain to whom they were dangerous. In time, you figured that out on your own. Your career moved through paths that can't be summarized in dates and titles, because what matters isn't the job title on the business card, it's the decisions made in moments when nobody is watching and nobody is going to applaud you. Decisions that in this line of work have consequences that surface years later, in places you didn't expect, in ways you didn't anticipate. You met your wife, Mariana, at a work function that shouldn't have been the place where anyone meets the love of their life, but life has that inconvenient habit of ignoring appropriate settings. Mariana was a lawyer specializing in human rights, which meant that your dinner conversations could turn into complex debates about the boundaries between institutional effectiveness and individual protections. She was the most honest person you'd ever met and the most uncomfortable to have around when you'd rather someone just agreed with you. You were married in a small ceremony in Coyoacan. 2 kids came after, Andres and Lucia, who grew up knowing their dad had a different kind of job than other dads, but who at home had the same man who read to them out loud before bed, and on Sundays made pancakes shaped like animals that never came out right but had the merit of the intention behind them. Lucia inherited her grandmother's mathematical precision. Andres inherited your tendency to ask questions nobody wants to answer. The years passed and the responsibilities grew. Each promotion brought new dimensions of the problem you had chosen to fight. And the problem in this country has roots so deep and branches so wide that sometimes the only way to keep perspective is to remember why you started. To remember your mom's voice explaining equations to 40 teenagers from rough streets. To remember that the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be doesn't close on its own. When you were appointed Secretary of Public Safety for Mexico City, the most visible and exposed position you'd held up to that point, the first thing you did was go to Tepito alone. No escorts, no cameras, no agenda. You walked the streets you'd known as a child, streets that had changed and hadn't changed at the same time, because streets in this country have that permanent duality of transforming on the surface while keeping their deepest essence intact. An older man selling newspapers on a corner recognized you. He looked at you for a long moment and then said, with no context or introduction, that he hoped you wouldn't forget where the people who pay taxes come from. He didn't give his name. You took the paper he offered and paid with a bill that didn't need change. That 10-second conversation with a nameless newspaper vendor was more useful than 100 cabinet meetings. But come back to the SUV. Come back to 2 in the morning and the changed route and the calm voice that told you about movement on the east side of the city. Because what that voice didn't tell you, what you worked out on your own over the next 20 minutes as the SUV moved through side streets with the radio silent, is that the information that coordinated group on the east side had didn't come from a casual leak. It was too specific. They knew your original route. They knew the schedule. They knew the number of units in your escort. That means the information didn't come from below. It came from above. And when information comes from above in this line of work, the problem isn't the immediate threat. The immediate threat can be evaded by changing routes, adding escorts, sleeping in a different place every night. The real problem is that you don't know who to trust inside the structure that's supposed to protect you. It's the kind of loneliness that has no name in any language, but that anyone who has ever held a position of real responsibility in this country knows all too well. Ernesto, your academy buddy, the one who could fall asleep in 2 minutes on any surface, died 6 years ago in an operation that went wrong in ways you still don't have completely explained. There's a file in a drawer somewhere that isn't closed and that you're not going to let stay closed as long as you hold this position, not because it's strategic, but because Ernesto had 2 daughters in Monterrey who deserve to know the full truth. And you promised him in the last message he sent you, 17 hours before everything went wrong, that if anything ever happened, you'd make sure things were made clear. That promise has cost you enemies you would have preferred not to have, but promises to the dead are the only ones with no escape clause. The SUV stops in front of a building in Polanco, 5th floor, an apartment that isn't in your name or anyone else's who can connect you directly to this address. Inside, there's a table with 3 computers, a whiteboard covered in names and dates connected by red lines, and a 40-year-old man named Ricardo Salinas, not the businessman, a different Ricardo Salinas, an intelligence analyst who has worked with you for 12 years and who has the distinction of being the most boring person alive in any social setting, and the most brilliant one in this. Ricardo doesn't look up when you walk in. He's staring at a screen with the concentration of someone reading the final chapter of a book that took years to understand. You ask him what he has. He tells you he has enough to confirm the leak is internal, but not enough yet to pinpoint exactly where it's coming from. He tells you he has 12 hours to close the analysis before the trails go cold. He says this with the same tone someone might use to order a cup of coffee. You sit down in front of the whiteboard and stare at it for a moment. The names on it are people you know. Some have been with you for years. Some were at your wedding. Some sent flowers when Lucia was born. And one of them, at some point you still can't pinpoint, made a decision that put them on the other side of a line that in this business has no gray zone. This is what nobody explains to you when you decide to enter public service with genuine conviction. They don't tell you that the most dangerous enemy doesn't always have an unfamiliar face. Sometimes it has the face of someone you've known for years, someone who on the surface shares your same values, who speaks the same institutional language, who in meetings says all the same right things you say, and who underneath that surface built something completely different. Betrayal in this context doesn't hurt the way personal betrayal does. It hurts differently, colder and deeper, because it's not only a wound to you, it's a wound to something larger than you, to the trust that people place in an institution when they choose to believe that there are people inside it genuinely working for their safety. When someone breaks that, they don't just betray you, they betray every person in every neighborhood in this city who closes their eyes at night expecting someone to be doing their job. There's a moment that happens between the call to Mariana and returning to Ricardo in the Polanco apartment. You stand in the hallway longer than you planned. The hallway smells like fresh paint and old coffee, that strange combination places get when people work too long without opening windows. There's a small window at the end that faces the street, and from there you can see the empty avenue with its orange streetlights illuminating the asphalt, wet from the automatic sprinklers running in the early morning hours. That's when your brother Carlos calls. Carlos doesn't call in the middle of the night. He never does. Since they were kids, he had the ability to respect other people's schedules with a consideration that bordered on ceremonial. If Carlos is calling at 3 in the morning, something made him do it. You answer. His voice isn't scared, it's controlled. In that specific way, voices get controlled when fear is present, but reason is managing it. He tells you, that 40 minutes ago, an SUV with tinted windows drove slowly past his house in Tlalpan twice. The same SUV. The same license plates covered in fresh mud that isn't rain mud because it hasn't rained in Tlalpan in 4 days. You feel the floor shift an inch even though the floor doesn't move. You tell him not to go outside, to turn on every light in the house, to stay on the phone. You make a second simultaneous call to one of your trusted people, one of the few whose name isn't on Ricardo's whiteboard, and send them to Carlos's address within the next 8 minutes. The SUV doesn't come back, but the message arrived with a clarity that needed no translation. Whoever leaked your route also knows where your brother lives. They also know in all likelihood where Mariana and the kids are, where your mom lives, where every person who could be used as leverage to break you can be found. This is no longer just an institutional intelligence problem. It's personal in a way you try not to let cloud the analysis, but that inevitably adds a different weight to every decision you make in the hours that follow. You go back to Ricardo and tell him to move faster. He doesn't ask why. In 12 years, he learned that when you change your tone without explanation, it's because something escalated, and that the best way he can help you in that moment is to work faster and talk less. Ricardo looks up from the screen for the first time since you arrived and says a name. I'm not going to write that name here, because this story isn't over yet, and because in stories like this one, names get said at the right moment, or they don't get said at all. But you hear it, and something inside you that you'd spent weeks trying not to confirm finally finds its exact shape. You don't say anything for 10 seconds. Then you ask Ricardo if he's sure. He tells you 80%. He tells you he needs the 12 hours for that. You tell him he has them. You step into the hallway and call Mariana. It's 2:45 in the morning. She picks up on the second ring because 15 years ago she learned to sleep with her phone nearby and to answer fast when it rings in the middle of the night. She doesn't ask what happened because she knows if you could tell her you already would have. She just asks if you're okay. You tell her yes. You ask if the kids are asleep. She says yes, that Lucia finished a biology project at 11 and that Andres fell asleep reading with the book on his face, like always. You smile even though no one can see you smile. You tell her not to take the kids anywhere in the morning without checking in with you first. She pauses. Inside that pause is the conversation you've had 100 times without saying it out loud. The conversation about the price a family pays when one of its members chose this work with this level of intensity. The unspoken agreement they built together over years. That fear exists but doesn't govern. That security measures aren't signs of weakness but of responsibility. She tells you, okay, take care of yourself. There'll be pancakes tomorrow. You hang up and go back to Ricardo. The hours that follow are a succession of encrypted calls, analysis of financial movements someone thought they'd erased, but that Ricardo has the unsettling ability to reconstruct from fragments that look like digital garbage, and a systematic review of classified information access over the past 4 months. At 5:15 in the morning, Ricardo tells you he has 100%. The name he gave you earlier was right. The procedure from that point forward isn't yours to decide alone. It has to go through formal channels, through legal structures, through processes that sometimes feel desperately slow when the problem is urgent, but that exist precisely so the solution doesn't reproduce the problem. That's the permanent tension of this work. You want fast results inside a system designed necessarily to be slow. You make the calls you have to make, you activate the appropriate protocols. You set something in motion that from this point forward is no longer only in your hands, but in those of an institutional chain that, when it works, is more powerful than any individual. When the sun starts coming through the window of the Polanco apartment with that deep orange light that Mexico City has when it's not quite fully awake yet, you sit down in a chair in front of the whiteboard and look at the names for a long moment. You think about the newspaper vendor in Tepito who told you not to forget where the people who pay taxes come from. You think about Ernesto falling asleep in 2 minutes on any surface. You think about your mom explaining equations to 40 teenagers from rough streets. You think about Lucia with her biology project and Andres with the book on his face. And you think, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, that the reason this work makes sense isn't the adrenaline of 2 in the morning or the weight of decisions nobody else wants to make. The reason it makes sense is that window in Polanco with the sun coming through, that city of millions of people who right now are doing what any city does when it wakes up, getting up, making breakfast, sending kids to school, opening the shop, getting on the subway, living. Living without knowing that last night someone changed a route and spent hours in front of a whiteboard so they could keep doing exactly that. That's not heroism, it's just the job. Tell us what country and what neighborhood you're watching from, because this story doesn't only happen at the heights of power or in offices with a view of the city. It happens in every neighborhood where someone chose to put on a uniform with conviction, and in every family waiting for that uniform to come home. The price of safety isn't paid only by the person who signs off on operations. It's paid by Mariana waiting for a call at 2 in the morning. It's paid by Carlos studying engineering while his younger brother chooses the harder road. It's paid by Monica, who grew up collecting animal stickers and learned early on that in her house, nights aren't always quiet. The heaviest part of the story isn't the enemy on the outside. It's the moment you look at a name on a whiteboard and recognize in it someone who at some point made a different choice than you did, not because they were less intelligent or less capable, but because at some crossroads they chose to turn where you held your line. And that difference, which from the outside looks small, changes absolutely everything. If this story made you think, if it made you see differently what it means for a city to function, if it reminded you that behind every institutional decision there are people who sleep little and think hard, subscribe so we can keep telling the stories that live in the places cameras don't always reach.